Nada Hurania was known as a devoted mother, but behind the walls of her quiet suburban home, her life was slipping away under the care of someone she trusted most. Nada Hurania's life looked ordinary from the outside, the kind of suburban picture people drove past without a second thought. Her modest home stood at the end of a quiet street where neighbors waved politely and children rode bicycles in the afternoon sun. To everyone who knew her, she was simply a hard-working mother raising 3 children after a difficult separation from her husband. She carried herself with a calm determination, the kind of strength people admired but didn't always understand. Every morning she made sure her children were ready for school, lunches packed neatly, reminders spoken with care. She drove them through the winding streets of the neighborhood, dropped them off with a smile, and returned to the house where silence lingered. On the surface, her day seemed steady and predictable, yet a quiet heaviness followed her everywhere. The divorce had drained her in more ways than one. The legal battles over finances and custody weighed on her shoulders, even as she tried to shield her children from the turmoil. Bills piled up on the kitchen counter, unopened letters gathering like an unspoken threat. Friends noticed how often she declined invitations, how her laughter had grown rare. Instead of confiding her worries, she carried them alone. Her greatest fear was failing her children, so she pushed herself to keep the household stable, no matter the cost to her own health. In the late evenings, when the house settled into silence, she often sat at the dining table with paperwork spread around her, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound keeping her company. Neighbors saw her as strong, but they did not see the moments of fatigue that struck when no one was watching. Sometimes she lingered too long in the driveway before stepping inside, gathering the energy to face another evening of teenage moods, schoolwork, and constant responsibility. Her life was not glamorous, but it was filled with small acts of love. That defined her character. Every decision she made was for the future of her children, even if that future seemed uncertain. She rarely asked for help, perhaps because she believed it was her duty to endure quietly, or perhaps because she trusted that tomorrow would somehow be easier. Her teenage son, however, seemed to grow more distant with each passing month. Once close to his mother, he now preferred the solitude of his room, the glow of a computer screen replacing family dinners. Nada assumed it was just adolescence, a difficult stage worsened by the divorce. She reassured herself that it was normal for teenagers to withdraw, even though something in her heart told her otherwise. She could feel the walls between them thickening, but she lacked the strength to push harder. Instead, she held on to the hope that time would heal the distance. What she didn't realize was that something darker was taking root, hidden beneath the silence of her home. The stress of balancing so many battles, financial, emotional, and personal, began to affect her health. She complained occasionally of headaches, of fatigue that seemed heavier than usual, but she brushed it off. Friends advised her to rest, but rest was a luxury she could not afford. Every ounce of energy was devoted to her children and to keeping their world from crumbling. If she noticed the subtle shifts in her household, the small tensions, the moments when her son's gaze lingered on her with unsettling coldness, she buried those thoughts beneath layers of denial. After all, it was easier to believe that life, though difficult, was still under control. The world around her, Nada, remained the image of resilience. A mother doing her best, a woman enduring the storm of separation, a neighbor who smiled politely despite her own struggles. But behind the quiet routine, a silent danger was already present. It lived within the very walls of the home she had built to protect her children. And though she could not see it, the danger was growing stronger each day, waiting patiently for the moment when the facade of ordinary life would finally shatter. The small changes in Nada's household began so quietly that they were easy to overlook. At first, it was just misplaced objects, a book left on the counter that she was certain had been in her room, a half-empty glass of water moved from one table to another. She dismissed them as her own forgetfulness, the kind that comes from stress and exhaustion. Yet as weeks passed, the strangeness grew harder to explain. A window she never touched was found wide open one morning, curtains billowing into the room as if someone had been watching from the outside. At night, When she lay in bed, she sometimes thought she heard faint movement in the hallway, soft, enough to make her question whether she imagined it. The house, once a place of comfort, began to feel unsettled, as if something unseen was shifting inside it. Her teenage son was changing too, and the shift was far more noticeable. He became detached, spending hours locked in his room, the door shut tightly while the faint sound of typing echoed from behind it. Meals were no longer shared. Excuses about homework or fatigue replaced conversations at the dinner table. His eyes, once filled with warmth when looking at his mother, now seemed guarded and cold. Nada reminded herself that teenagers often withdrew, that the turbulence of divorce could leave wounds that took time to heal. Still, there was a heaviness in his silence that unsettled her. She tried small gestures, leaving his favorite snacks in the kitchen, knocking on his door to ask about his day, but he met her efforts with indifference. The neighbors noticed the boy too. He wandered the streets late at night, hood pulled. Over his head, walking with a restlessness that seemed far older than his years. Some thought he was just struggling to adjust to the separation, a boy caught between parents, searching for his place in the world. Others whispered about his distant stare, the way he avoided eye contact when spoken to. Still, no one suspected that these changes were anything more than growing pains. To the outside world, nothing about the Huronier household seemed extraordinary. The cracks were visible only to those inside. Stranger incidents began to trouble Nada more deeply. One afternoon, she found the back door unlocked after being certain she had secured it that morning. Another time, she discovered a faint chemical odor in the kitchen, sharp and unnatural, though no cleaning products had been used that day. She shrugged it off as coincidence, blaming her own overworked mind. Yet beneath her denial, a quiet unease stirred. She began to feel watched in her own home, as if someone's eyes followed her from room to room. She told herself it was just the stress of the ongoing court battles, the endless paperwork that consumed her thoughts. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. Her health began to falter as well. She grew weaker, plagued by headaches and sudden waves of dizziness that left her clutching the edge of counters for balance. She thought it was exhaustion, perhaps the price of juggling too many responsibilities. She never connected the symptoms to the subtle changes in her environment. Instead, she carried on, forcing herself to smile through the pain, determined not to show her children how tired she truly was. She convinced herself that with time, the strange feelings would pass, that life would return to normal once the stress of the divorce eased. But the changes inside her home were not fleeting. They were part of something deliberate, something far more dangerous than she realized. Each misplaced item, each unexplained sound, each cold glance from her son was another warning she failed to see. The atmosphere in the house grew heavier, the air itself thick with unspoken tension. The warmth that once defined her home was slowly disappearing, replaced by a sense of quiet menace. And though Nada pushed away the uneasy thoughts, pretending that everything was under control, truth was closing in. The danger she feared was not outside her walls but growing silently within them, preparing for the moment when it would no longer hide. The night it happened began like any other, with the calm stillness of summer settling over the neighborhood. The air was warm, cicadas humming faintly outside, and the glow of streetlights cast long shadows on the quiet suburban road. Inside Nada's house, the day had ended in its usual routine, her children tucked away in their rooms, doors closed, the house sinking into silence. Nothing seemed unusual, nothing seemed threatening. Yet hidden in that ordinary night was the moment when everything changed. When morning arrived, the peace was broken. Nada was discovered lifeless in her bedroom, her body lying in a position that suggested she had simply fallen asleep and never woken up. At first glance, there were no signs of disturbance. Her bed was neatly made around her, no broken furniture, no overturned items. The windows were intact, the doors locked. There were no bruises, no wounds, no marks of violence. It was as though death had entered the room softly, without sound, and claimed her in her sleep. For her children, the discovery was terrifying and confusing. For investigators, it was a mystery that did not fit neatly into any explanation. Initial assumptions pointed toward natural causes. She had been under stress, she had seemed tired, and some thought her body had simply given in. But doubts surfaced quickly. Friends described her as fatigued but not ill, weary but far too young, to collapse without warning. The medical examiner noted that her sudden death did not align with what they were seeing. If it had been a heart condition, the evidence wasn't there. If it had been a stroke, there were no clear signs. The absence of an obvious cause unsettled everyone involved. It was as though her body had been drained of life without a struggle, without leaving a single trace of how the house itself raised. Questions. Her children claimed they heard nothing unusual through the night. No cries, no movement, no disturbance. Neighbors hadn't noticed anything either. No strangers lurking outside, no vehicles arriving in the dark hours. Whoever, or whatever, had caused her death had done so without drawing attention. The silence of the night became its own clue. A haunting reminder that not all tragedies announce themselves with chaos. Some unfold quietly, almost invisibly, until the damage is complete. Police officers combed through the rooms, searching for anything out of place. They looked for signs of forced entry, signs of a break-in, signs of struggle. There were none. It was as though the house had swallowed the truth, hiding it within its walls. For investigators, this was more than just a mystery. It was a puzzle that defied reason. A mother gone without a sound, a home untouched, and a family that claimed to know nothing. The scene was chilling precisely because of its normality. Speculation grew quickly. Some wondered if stress alone could have killed her. Others whispered about undetected health issues. Yet as the hours turned into days, more troubling questions arose. The children's accounts of the night were vague, and the teenage son appeared especially distant. While others in the family displayed grief openly, he remained cold, withdrawn, his face giving little away. At first, it was dismissed as shock, a young boy's way of coping with loss. But to detectives, it was unsettling. His detachment felt different, almost practiced, as if he were watching events unfold from a distance rather than living through them. The medical team's findings made the situation darker still. Though nothing visible marked her body, internal examinations revealed irregularities, clues that something foreign might have been introduced to her system. This shifted the narrative completely. If her death had not been natural, then it was deliberate. And if it was deliberate, then the killer had been careful enough to leave behind no immediate evidence, no trace of struggle, no sign of intrusion. This pointed not to a stranger, but to someone with access, someone close, someone who knew her routines and could act without raising suspicion. The neighborhood was shaken when whispers of foul play began to circulate. The idea that a mother could die in her own home, surrounded by her children, without anyone knowing what had happened, was terrifying. People locked their doors more tightly, checked their windows twice, and wondered who among them could be capable of something so cruel. But the truth was far more unsettling than anyone imagined. The threat had never been outside. It had been inside all along, moving silently, patient and deliberate, waiting for the moment to strike. The answers began to surface when the toxicology report came back. Hidden inside the details of the examination was a truth that shattered the early assumptions. Nada had not died suddenly from exhaustion, nor had her body simply given up under stress. There were traces of a foreign substance in her system, the kind that could not have appeared by accident. It was a poison, slow and deliberate, carefully chosen to mimic illness while escaping quick detection. This discovery changed the course of the investigation entirely. What had once looked like a quiet tragedy was now the unmistakable work of a killer. The search for who could have carried out such an act began with those closest to Nada. Her estranged husband was the first to be scrutinized. Their separation had been bitter, marked by disputes over money and custody. He had motive, and many assumed resentment might have pushed him to a desperate act. Investigators combed through his records, his movements, and his calls. Yet nothing tied him directly to the night of her death. He was questioned, his alibi checked, and though suspicion lingered in the air, the evidence simply did not point toward him. The police knew they needed to look elsewhere. Attention soon turned to the household itself. If there had been no forced entry, then whoever poisoned Nada had likely been inside the home already. The unsettling reality began to take shape. The silent killer may not have come from outside, but from within her own walls. Detectives searched computers, phones, and personal devices for clues. That was when the most chilling evidence was uncovered. On the family's shared computer, a trail of internet searches appeared. Questions about poisons, symptoms of various chemicals, and methods of concealment. The searches had not been made at random. They were consistent, detailed, and deliberate. Whoever had typed those words into the search bar had been planning, step by step, the method of her death. The timing of those searches matched too closely with the period when Nada's health began to falter. Her headaches, her sudden fatigue, her unexplained dizziness, each symptom aligned with the poisons being researched. The investigators pieced the puzzle together. She had not been falling ill naturally, but had been weakened gradually, her body responding to a substance hidden in the most ordinary parts of her daily life. The question now was who had done it. The husband had already been under scrutiny, but the searches came from within the house itself. Logs revealed that they were carried out late at night, at times when only one person had been awake. That person was her teenage son. Detectives could hardly believe it at first. The idea of a child deliberately seeking out such information, plotting something so cold, seemed unthinkable. Yet the evidence was difficult to dismiss. His late-night hours at the computer, his increasingly withdrawn behavior, and his disturbing indifference after her death all seemed to align. Investigators began to look more closely at his life, his actions, and his state of mind. They discovered more signs that had gone unnoticed before. Teachers had described him as distracted, his schoolwork slipping, his temper flaring more easily. Friends recalled conversations where he spoke bitterly about his mother, portraying her not as a caretaker but as someone who restricted him, someone he resented. The image of a troubled teenager now took on a darker shape, a boy quietly nurturing anger, channeling it into something deadly. Forensic specialists worked to connect the pieces. They tested food containers, drinks, and everyday items from the house. Traces of the same poison appeared, hidden where only someone living there could have placed them. The quiet poisoning had not been a one-time event but a repeated act, a calculated effort to weaken her slowly over time. This was not the work of impulse. It was premeditated, carried out with a chilling patience that belied his age. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community. Neighbors who had once waved to him on the street now looked back at their memories with unease. Teachers replayed classroom moments in their minds, searching for warning signs they had missed. The thought that a mother had been killed not by a stranger but by her own child was almost too much to comprehend. Yet as the evidence mounted, the truth became undeniable. The silent killer investigators had been searching for was not hiding outside in the dark. He had been inside all along, eating at the same table, walking the same halls, and planning the end of the woman who had given him everything. When the full truth came into view, it stunned everyone who had followed the case. The image of a mother silently dying in her own home had been tragic enough, but learning that her death had been orchestrated by her own son transformed the story into something far darker. Investigators pieced together a narrative that revealed not just a single night of violence but a long and calculated plan that had unfolded quietly over weeks. Each symptom Nada had brushed aside, each moment of fatigue she had explained away, had not been random. They had been the signs of poison, steadily taking hold, administered by the person she trusted most. The boy had studied carefully, using late-night internet searches to learn which substances could cause illness without immediate suspicion. He tested small doses first, adjusting the amounts as he monitored her reactions. The slow decline of his mother's health was not an accident but the direct result of his persistence and patience. He showed no rush, no panic, only a chilling determination to finish what he had started. Each day she grew weaker, and each day he concealed the truth behind a mask of indifference. To those outside the home, His behavior could be explained as the awkward distance of adolescence. But behind closed doors, it was evidence of his ability to carry out cruelty without remorse. What drove him to such an act became the central question for investigators, psychologists, and the community. Anger over the divorce was one piece of the puzzle. He had begun to view his mother as the obstacle between himself and freedom, blaming her for the restrictions and limitations he felt. Instead of seeing her sacrifices, he saw control. Instead of recognizing her exhaustion, he saw weakness. Resentment grew in silence until it transformed into something far more dangerous. To him, removing her was not simply revenge but a way to claim power over a life he felt he had no control of. The trial that followed was harrowing. The details of the poisoning, the computer searches, the evidence of deliberate planning, all of it painted a picture that left the courtroom stunned. Witnesses who had once known him as a polite, if withdrawn teenager struggled to reconcile that image with the cold reality presented by prosecutors. Teachers testified about his growing isolation, neighbors spoke of his late-night wanderings, and experts described the methods he had studied to ensure his crime would succeed. At every turn, the story became less about an impulsive act and more about the horrifying patience of a calculated mind. For the community, the revelation shattered a sense of safety. The idea that danger might come from a stranger outside the home was frightening, but it was something people could understand. What they struggled to accept was that a child could carefully plan the death of his own mother. It was not just a crime, but a betrayal that cut against the very foundation of family. Parents began to look at their own children with new unease, wondering how well they truly knew them. Conversations behind closed doors were filled with fear and disbelief, as everyone tried to understand how something like this could happen so close to home. For those who had loved Nada, the grief was immeasurable. Friends remembered her as a woman who gave everything for her children, who fought through hardship without complaint, who never asked for more than a little peace. To lose her in such a way felt cruel beyond words. She had carried the weight of her family on her shoulders, only to have that weight turned against her by the very person she had protected. Her story became more than a crime. It became a symbol of how blind trust can sometimes hide unimaginable danger. The final judgment confirmed what many had already feared. He was found responsible for his mother's death, his actions described as deliberate, cold, and carefully executed. The verdict brought closure in a legal sense, but it could never repair the deeper wounds left behind. Nada's life was cut short not by illness, not by accident, but by the silent plotting of someone she loved unconditionally. The tragedy left behind a haunting reminder that sometimes the most terrifying threats are not strangers wading in the dark, but the ones already inside the home, moving quietly, unseen, until it is too late.